Welcome to the 1000 Hours Outside podcast. My name is Ginny Urich. I'm the founder of 1000 Hours Outside, and I have just read the most phenomenal book, thought-provoking from cover to cover, and the author is here with us. What a treat. Dr. Madeline Levine, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for your kind words.
I mean, cover to cover, this one is a page turner. The one I read of yours, and it's one of several books that you have, is called Ready or Not: Preparing Our Kids to Thrive in an Uncertain and Rapidly Changing World. What a title. That one draws every parent in.
So
Absolutely.
that book was published the week before lockdown for COVID, and I had no idea. I was writing it 2 years before that,
Right?
but yeah. So
Yeah,
it,
can you
it
even
was like,
imagine the timing could not have been more perfect? So you're a psychologist with close to 40 years experience as a clinician, consultant, educator, and author, the author of New York Times bestsellers, Teach Your Children Well, The Price of Privilege, the co-founder of Challenge Success. You have a whole lot going on. Can you just tell us a little bit about your path and a little bit of your story here to these books and these different topics that you so eloquently write about?
thanks. I like that question because it gives me the chance to illustrate something that I think is really important, which is that most people don't have a straight path. You know, the idea that you got to get your kid into the right kindergarten so they'll get into the right high school, so they'll get into the right college, so they'll get a good job with a lot of money. Like that straight line trajectory is actually a lot of mythology. And when I used to speak for years, I'd put up a slide saying, did you take the straight path or the squiggly path?
Mhm.
And no matter where I was in the country, no matter where, or in Hong Kong at Goldman Sachs or at my local fire station, only 1 to 10% of people took a straight path. So that's the context.
Mhm.
I went to the State University of New York at Buffalo. My dad unfortunately died when I was very young,
Mm.
so we had very little in the way of resources. We were on welfare. And I became a teacher first because I needed to make a living as soon as I
Mhm.
got out of school. And I was a very bad teacher. And that's not false humility. I was a very bad teacher
Hmm.
because like discipline is not my strong suit. I was teaching in the South Bronx of New York, tough area.
Mhm.
But what I was really good at was going home with the kids after school and sitting at a table with, I was teaching middle school with the young man often and his mom. That
Mhm.
was the usual combination. And trying to figure out how to get the kid an education, which they weren't getting in the school, and how to get them a skill set to get out of the inner city, which is where they lived. So I have this feeling that our failures really help us see
Mhm.
what our strengths are, and
Wow.
that's the way it goes for the vast majority of people.
Mhm.
So parents who get really anxious, like my kid doesn't have a passion, that stuff doesn't fall out of the sky. It takes
Mhm.
years to figure out what you like, what you're good at. Yeah, that's my path.
Yeah, I love the squiggly line. I have thought back to that so many times. I've talked to a lot of people about that. I think that it's just such a message of hope, and it helps you feel a little bit less stressed because you had an interesting story in there about Steve Jobs and typography. Just really interesting things to think about. And so I've been thinking about that in terms of my own life and our kids. One of the biggest topics in here is that things have changed.
Mhm,
Change has changed. And
mhm,
you talk about that the rules have changed. And because
mhm.
we're sort of so stressed out, parents tend to double down. I love all the wording that you used, double down on the old ways. So
Yeah.
I think we all have this inkling that it has changed. But you've been doing this, like you said, you've written a book 25 years ago. What
Mhm.
are some of the big things that have changed in terms of parenting in the last couple decades?
Well, in terms of parenting, for sure, it has become this kind of intensive parenting that Mike, I have three grown millennial kids, and the oldest one it wasn't that way 40 years ago. He's 40 years old. It wasn't. My youngest 30, it had started already. So
Wow.
the idea of constantly being involved, I don't know about the schools you have, but out here in Marin County, where I raised my kids, there was something called Power School. So which I call Power Snoop. It meant you could snoop on your kids all day long. If they had a pop quiz, how'd they do? If they didn't turn in their homework, how'd they do? That was
Mm,
unheard of, certainly when I was being raised, and even when my oldest was being raised. So this, and it's a very interesting question, which I don't think has been fully answered, as to what initiated that change. I think
mm,
part of it's economic. Um, my dad was a cop. I'm a PhD, right? It was always that the next generation could go one step better. That's probably not the case anymore. And so what? It's not the end of the world if your kid has a different profession or makes a different kind of income than you do. But people have become incredibly competitive. All
mm.
those bumper stickers that say, my child is an honor student. What that really is I'm an honor parent,
Yeah.
as if your child's accomplishment is your accomplishment. And being an involved parent is really, really important. But being over involved is very damaging in many ways. And I think it's why we're seeing this huge uptick in anxiety, depression, all those kinds of
Hmm.
things.
Yeah. And then you talk about sort of the skill sets that are coming that kids are going to need. And I think this is something that every parent needs to hear. And you talk about how because we're scared, it's hard to make the right decision because we don't really even know what we're preparing for, and that causes a lot of anxiety. But you do such an amazing job in this book, time and again, talking about what kids are going to need and how they
Mhm.
can get those skills. So, can you tell parents? I mean, obviously, people used to stay in jobs for their whole lifetime. And then in
Right.
this book, you say, well, they're going to have 4 jobs in the first decade out of college. So, how do we prepare kids, just like the subtitle, for a rapidly changing world?
So one thing is, we don't prepare them the way we used to be prepared. You used to go to school more or less, and as I've said about my own story, it was never a straight road. So I'll often have parents say to me, who's pushing and pushing and pushing a kid to go to Brown, and the parent will say, Brown was great for me. How could it not be great for my kid? Well, it might be great for your kid, but not necessarily, because the skill set is very different. And I have this story, which is one of my favorites, so I'll repeat it. This became real to me, excuse me, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Um, I was refinancing my house, and my youngest son asked if he could come along, and I said sure. And we went to First Republic Bank and met with the manager of the mortgage department. And Jeremy was with me. He was being who he usually is, which is very attentive. And so I was there an hour and a half, twice, 20 seconds each. She says, Ma, the time's running. You want me to put a quarter in the parking meter? I said, sure, go ahead. My voice is always kind of scratchy. At one point he said, I saw tea outside, Mom. Would you like some with honey? And then he turns to the head of the department and says, would you like a cup? Maybe 90 seconds out of the 90 minutes. And when that is over, I get my mortgage, and she turns to my son and says, I'd like to offer you a job. Now,
Wow.
yeah, it was a wow moment, but it was a really important moment. She didn't know a thing about my son in the sense that we think about
Wow.
hiring. She didn't know if he was a drug dealer, if he went to college, if he went to Stanford, or the community. She knew nothing. So of course I was
Wow.
fascinated by this, and I said, could you tell me a little bit about that decision? And what she said, and what I heard over and over again while writing that book, she said, I can teach him the skills to be in my department. I can't teach him to be the person I want sitting next to me when I have a cold, when I forgot something. I can't teach him that. And
Wow.
I heard that from at Google, at LinkedIn, at Bank of America, at every major place that I went to, what we used to unfortunately call soft skills.
Hmm.
And I use foundational because I don't like soft. It's like mushy, and it's not.
Right.
It's empathy, it's self-regulation, it's awareness of what's going on, it's collaboration, it's a little bit of risk taking because he's
Hmm.
talking in an environment that he doesn't really know anything about. And that's the skill set that people are looking for. Now, are there technical jobs that need a lot of technical knowledge? Of course, but they are much fewer than people think, much
Hmm.
fewer than people think. And so so the idea of like straight A's, which always struck me as ridiculous, because if you're honest with yourself, you're not I can't I'm not straight A
Nope.
at lots of things, right?
Yep. For
um
sure. How can we all be
yeah,
straight A's at all of the things?
right. And I'm a basketball fan. You go to your right, like you do in basketball, you go to your strong side. And so I often think about this. I was an average math student. I was a very good English student. And if my parents had pulled me out and put me with tutors and spent the time trying to get my math grade up, one, it never would have happened. And two, I would have lost the time on something I liked and was really good at. So the
Mhm.
parent who calls and says, I heard your talk and I want to talk about my son's grades. And I know what's coming. The son has four A's and a C. And she's not calling about the four A's, she's calling about the C. And so it's been a big mistake for a long time. But having had that experience, that was what made me think there's something to write about in here,
Mhm.
that he would be. And just to close the link on the story, so he was in college at the time. He was in his last year of college. So he finished the next year, took the job, hated it. um and but same, I guess, I just realized at this minute, same
Mm.
as my story. Hated it.
Yes.
And he's a lawyer now and he loves what he's doing.
Mhm.
So he needed that experience to find out what he wasn't good at and what
Yes,
he
to
didn't
learn what you
love.
don't like. You talked in the book, and you never hear people say this. You said not everyone is a Harvard or Yale student. Not, isn't it okay that some kids are B students? And I used to work with this man. I used to teach as well. I taught high school math, ironically. Um, but I had this coworker that was just real wise, and he would say all of these parents that were getting their kids all of these extra tutorings for SAT, ACT. He says, well, why are you doing that? Then your kid's going to maybe end up in a spot that they're kind of out of their league and they're
Hmm.
really going to struggle. And I thought that made a lot of sense. So it's
Hmm.
like, why can't we just let our kids be who they are? That seems to be something that has really changed. It-
So
Have you noticed?
well, that's an interesting expression, be who they are. So kids, I think, are in process, right? And what parents are trying to do, I haven't thought about it this way, what parents are trying to do is mold that process. Now, some of that's absolutely necessary, right? You don't go
Mhm.
across the street against the light, you don't take heroin. I mean, there's a lot of things we need to do. But I have a very strong feeling about what happens when we do things that are not necessary.
Mm.
And that says a lot in that book about what I call accumulated disability. And that is the outcome of parents who come in for a child prematurely or unnecessarily with all good intentions. Because I mean, you have five kids, you should be doing this interview. You have on the ground experience. We cannot avoid our kids being unhappy. We can't, right? I raised three kids. Now I have
Mhm.
grandchildren. They're unhappy some of the time. And the
Mhm.
real test is, can they deal with it, right? They don't live in my house anymore. I'm very lucky they live close by, but they don't live here. And this idea that you can protect your children when they don't get invited to the popular kids party, when they don't make the team that they wanted to make, when somebody doesn't sit with them at lunch, and we go up to school and say, that is that bullying, and you're supposed to do something. It's a huge mistake, because mostly what I see, Jenny, are late teenagers, young adults.
Mhm.
And I see them because they're missing an entire skill set of management, risk management, conflict management.
Mhm.
We just came through COVID, where kids were locked up
Yeah.
for a couple of years. I'm in California. And the kids who had no capacity to manage were in a lot of trouble. We're seeing a big uptick, and it's not over. COVID's not over for a lot of these
Mhm.
kids who miss time. But I like it in simple terms. Like, I think the example I use in that book is the dog, walking past a dog. So, your
Yeah.
8-year-old comes home and is a little teary and a little trembly and says, "The dog barked at me and I'm really scared. I don't want to walk past the dog. It's, a neighbor's dog or something." And you have three options. One is, I'm sorry. One,
You're
good take
fine.
some
You're
water.
fine. This is what happens when you're in hot demand and everyone wants to hear what you have to say, right?
Yeah, it's a challenge at this point.
Mhm.
Um, one of your options is to say some variation of "man up," like, I don't, too
Mhm. Deal
bad.
with it,
Dog's
right?
right. Another option is to say, "Oh, honey, you look scared and you're crying, and I'm so sorry. And tomorrow I'm going to drive you to school, and we'll go around the block so you don't have to be scared by the dog." And that's an equally bad option, and I'll say
Mhm.
why in a minute. And the third option is to be supportive. I see you're really scared. Maybe tomorrow I'll walk with you, and I could do that for a day or two till you feel a little more comfortable.
Mhm.
That's your better option. Why is it a bad idea to avoid it? Take the car and drive around the block, because that's life. Life is a series of small challenges. And if we can meet them, we go on to bigger and bigger challenges. So if you're a young child,
Wow.
it's who's got the shovel in the sandbox. And if you're a little older, it might be, a barking dog. And when you get a little older than that, it's being left out of the popular group. And then it's the boy or the girl who breaks your heart. It just they
Mhm.
get bigger and bigger.
Yeah.
And if you haven't had the practice of meeting those challenges successfully, you don't have that skill set. And I think we get really hung up more with older kids. So I have grandchildren now, very young grandchildren, and I'm watching
Congratulations.
them. Thank you. The best. uh, and I get to watch them again, like my children, learn how to walk, right? And they take a few steps and they fall down, and they take a few steps and they fall down, and everybody's applauding, "Yeah, get up again, Jackson. That was great. Try it again." Nobody is saying you're going to be flipping hamburgers if you don't learn, get up. It's
Right.
not like that. I think this is important, actually, as I hear myself. We have to not only allow it, we have to take some pleasure in it,
Mhm. Cheer
right?
it on.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I'm just thinking about, we were with my grandson, who's 1 and doesn't talk yet, last night. So my husband and he are just barking at each at each other, making sounds at each other. And that was a great interaction. But imagine if, my husband said, "Well, don't talk to me till you can talk in complete sentences." Like,
Wow. Right.
they would both miss they would both miss a lot of pleasure. So I
Mhm.
haven't thought about that before, but it
Yeah,
ought
we
to
lose
be.
that. We lose that
Yeah,
over the course of time very quickly, I think. Very quickly, all of a sudden, it feels like, oh, wait, they're behind, and we've got to make sure we're pushing them. One of the things that stood out to me in your book which is very eye-opening. You talk about all these skills that kids are going to need, and it's interesting. I wrote down so many of them: flexibility, collaboration, critical thinking, curiosity, empathy, optimism, adaptability, all of these enthusiasm, self-sufficiency, all of these different skills. And one of the ones that you talked about quite a bit was the the social skills. And so with 1000 hours outside, we're we're having this goal of play
Hmm.
because it's been
Hmm.
lost along the way, and it is a simple premise. It's very impactful. These kids are having a lot of social interactions with other kids and mixed ages. And when you talked about the social skills in the book in several different parts, you're talking about how these kids are going to have a whole bunch of different colleagues, which I thought
Hmm.
was really interesting. So can you talk to us about the that part of childhood, the interpersonal skills? It came up time and again of what kids are going to need. You talked about Google's Project Oxygen in there, and that some kids have never had the chance to feel bad, and
Right,
just so
right.
many great
I'm
things.
I'm smiling because the issue of play. So I'm a psychologist for 40 years. The issue of play has been around for at least since I was in graduate school, and yet it is still a question I have to answer at. I've been to like 300 schools around the country. Somebody always says, well, you know, you say play is good or being outdoors, but I'm too afraid to have my child outdoor, or there's nobody else to play with because there
Right.
are no other children outdoors. And I think that if people really understood what you're doing, really understood it, the value of play, the value of being outdoors, it's not just, oh, they get to play. I mean, the research is so clear that kids who spend out, you know all this, spend time outdoors, they have better social skills, they have better coordination, they get more vitamin D, they are in better control of their emotions. I mean, the list is as
Yeah.
long as the list you just wrote me about things that'll be needed. And it's really shocking to me that this is still controversial. The fact is that it's a safer time than ever before for kids to be playing outside, much safer than when I was growing up, when my kids were growing up. I have kids probably your age. Um, so that whole safety issue is just this hypervigilance that people have, and the 24-hour news cycle, which
Mhm.
is, you don't want me to go off on that, but it's really, I think, in
Yeah.
many ways, unbelievably destructive. So something bad happens and you hear about it time and time and time again,
Right.
as if it's happening over and over again, which it isn't. So I think the value of making sure kids are outside, in, I think it's in England, where they have these playgrounds. Have you seen these playgrounds where there's saws and hammers and
Yes.
like all this kind of stuff, like an American parent would go out of their mind.
Hmm.
And yet the kids learn how to do it. That, I mean, nobody wants kids to be hurt. They
Hmm.
will. There's a good book, The Blessing of a Skinned Knee by Wendy
Right. I mean,
Mogul.
but you read your book and you think, okay, maybe I do want my kids to be hurt. I mean, that's sort of what
Yeah,
I get out of it is, okay, my kids are complaining because their backpack is too heavy or because they're tired and so I've started to view things a little bit differently. Like, okay, well, this is okay. It's okay to be challenged. It's okay for things to be hard. And this is going to help you in the future. Like you said, the hardships just continue to get larger, the challenges get larger. So you want your
right.
kids to be able to handle that.
Right. So a funny experience. The last talk I gave before COVID, before lockdown, it was at a private school here in San Francisco, big audience, like 500 people, and they were just kind of carrying on about pushing their kids. That's not nice of me to say carrying on, but that's what it felt like, you know.
Mhm.
Things were so hard. They were studying too hard, which kids are spending way too much time on homework, because we know exactly how much homework is beneficial, and a lot of kids are doing a lot more than that. Anyway, so
Well,
there's
what's the number? What's the number?
the number for public school, I'm sorry, elementary school is actually zero. But the concession is a half hour per grade. No, 15 minutes per grade, 15 minutes per grade, or 10 minutes per grade. You know, it
Mhm.
would be like 10 minutes
Right.
for a first grader.
Mhm.
And for middle school, it's an hour and a half. And for high school, it's no more than 3 hours. And what happens after that is the learning just drops off. There's really no point in it. And the head of every school, Harris is the guy, I believe, who did this very definitive study, like a meta-analysis, meaning
Mhm.
lots of studies. Um, every head of school knows this. And when I talk to them about it, they say, yeah, but the parents, we say we're going to cut back on homework, and the parents are upset that the school won't be as competitive. I
Wow.
wish I wish parents, this is my 2 cents on parenting. Well, I've just given a half hour, but anyway, my important 2 cents, I think, is think of you raising children as a movie. And I'm no different than any other parent. When my oldest son, when we moved to the suburbs, and I was going to take him out of a private school, put him in the public schools. All my kids went to public school eventually. And I had him tested, and the tester said, no, he can't go to a public school. It would be a big mistake for your son, and blah, blah, blah. Well, he went to public school. He did fine, and he went to UCLA. He's a lawyer, and he's got 2 kids. And like, if you take it moment by moment, you get caught up in that moment, right? And
Mhm.
that's not what raising children is. It's a 30-year project easily, and it's a movie. You,
Mhm.
we get so, oh, he didn't make the team. Oh, he didn't get into his first place school. Oh, she didn't get asked by this guy. That if I could communicate anything, and I'm not very good at it because I don't really have the language yet, but when your kids are grown up, my kids are grown up now, all that matters to me is what kind of people they are. That's all
Mhm.
that matters to me, that they make good choices about who they marry, that
Mhm.
they're good parents, that they
Yeah.
contribute. Um, and it, while you kind of know that in the back of your head when you're raising children,
Mhm.
it's you still get drawn into the day-to-day competition, and it's, I can't tell you more than just to say, at the end of the day, you want your kid to be good people, make
Mhm.
good choices.
Yeah.
And that's the idea of the
Yeah.
movie.
It's interesting because you had this statement in the book that I feel like is maybe a little controversial, and maybe I didn't even quite read it in the way that you intended. But you were talking about sort of the tiger mother, that this is, we've all sort of become these parents that are pushing. That's the word that you've used so many times. We're pushing. And even you talked a lot about how about the teens are pushing themselves now.
Right.
Even they can't pull it back, but the pushing. And you had the statement where you said, this was a really big statement. It's a lot easier to practice a piece of music for 4 hours than to navigate the group dynamics and status rivalries of a room full of 14-year-old girls. And I almost wonder if, in some ways, because things are so scary and uncertain, it's easier in some sense to grasp onto the things that we can measure because everything else is chaotic
Right.
and we don't really know. We don't really know if the kids go hang out at the park. We can't measure that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it feels scary and it feels uncertain. Do you think that I thought that that statement about because I don't, the 4 hours of music, actually, that would seem like that would be hard, but then in some sense, it's filling their time. You know what they're doing.
Right. And in all fairness, that's not my statement. That statement was written by, not Frank Bruni, by a New York Times uh, writer
Okay, so
a
that was a
minute ago.
quote. That was a quote that was
Yeah, it
in the
was a
book.
quote, which I
Correct.
loved also.
Hmm.
Um,
It's
so,
thought provoking.
well, but I think you hit on something picked out something really important in there. And that's, I think our own anxiety is so high that a lot of the mistakes that we're making, because, I go to schools where I've spoken 3 times. they've heard over and over again. So it's not for lack of information. It's not, it's not a lack of information that your listeners have. It's something else that gets in the way of being able to live this instead of just
Yes,
hear
that's
this.
what you say. You say you have to do less, but getting parents to back off is often very challenging.
Right. But so why is, if I
Mhm.
said to you, you're serving whatever kind of fruit, and they just found out that it's toxic to children and leads to I mean, you'd stop it in a heartbeat, right?
Right.
So we have all this information that says, constant pushing, constant using metrics to determine the value of a kid. The number of kids who have said to me, I don't know if it's in there, I'm only as good as my last performance, meaning I'm only as good as my last test, my last report card. I mean,
Yeah.
that's an awful, awful way to feel. So
Hmm.
why aren't parents listening to this? And that's part of the reason I wrote this last book. I mean, I really kind of said what I had to say in the first two books about child development,
Hmm.
and individual families benefited. Did I think the whole country benefited, even though they were big sellers? I don't think so. And I think I said to you earlier, I don't think that question's fully been answered of
Right.
why not? If your child's physical health was at risk, you take care of it in a heartbeat. But
Mm,
you have the biggest universities, the best research in the world saying essentially kids need the four S's. I don't know if that's in there. This is from Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson Payne. They need to be safe, secure, seen, and soothed, right? And everything after that is gravy. And
wow.
so, why aren't parents hearing that? I think it's because we've lost community. I think it's because lockdown didn't help because there was a lot of isolation.
Yeah.
Um, Religion is playing less and less of a role in people's lives. The structures that made
Mm.
people feel part of something have diminished. And I think that leaves us very anxious when we're facing stuff we don't know. It used to
Mhm.
be my mother's mother lived down the street. There was a problem. She didn't go to, you know, a parenting expert. There was no such thing. She
Right.
went to her mother down the block. We don't have that, right?
Yeah.
I'm very lucky my kids live close to me, but
Yeah.
most people, many people, that's not the case. So if you're facing the unknown, you don't have the structure, you don't have the rabbi, you don't have the priest, you don't have your mother, you don't have your mother-in-law, we're kind of lost, and we focus
Yeah.
in on the family. That becomes our touchstone. And you people always think I'm writing about children, which I am, but I'm also writing about parents because our rates of anxiety and depression have gone up just as much as our kids.
Mhm.
And which came first? Which came first? Probably the fact
Mhm.
that our own rates are going up is, and
Ooh,
anxiety is kind of catching, right?
yeah.
You live in an anxious
That is an
house, you're more
interesting
likely to become
question.
it.
Right. And then you say in there, we have to guard their mental health, which you don't ever really hear anybody say. You hear people talk about the statistics, but there's never that next step that says, hey, parent, hey, educator, do something about it or see if there's something that you can do about it. And that was a very eye-opening part. You had that in the part where you were talking about should parents put limits on social media? Like, yes, they should, because we have to guard their mental health and we have to be the ones, you say we have to insist that anxiety be met with courage and all of these things that really help optimism and gratitude. And so it was this thought that I don't even know if I really had the thought before that. You just think, oh, I've got to feed them and make sure they have good grades. That
Mhm,
kind of
mhm.
feels to be the whole of parenting. This message about what are you doing to help the mental health of your children, of your family? You said
You
it,
know, you just
but it seems
you
to get
hit
lost.
on one of my favorite lines that I keep on my computer, which is why I'm leaning in. It says, I don't even know where I got this from. Why is it that we have invested so much into material and scientific technology to build better material goods, yet we do so little about building better children? And better children is not about higher grades. Better children is, and you have to answer that yourself. You have to answer yourself, what is raising a successful child mean?
Mhm.
For some people, it means good grades. I think that's a mistake. And I think that has to do with what the parents fear, what's missing in the parents' lives. I think in that book I had the young man who was in advanced calculus came to my office because his father had a grade every pop quiz he got. He's in advanced calculus. Why can't he grade it himself? And
Wow.
the fathers and the kids in the office, because he's got trichotillomania, which he's pulling out his eyebrows and his eyelashes, and I said to the father, you got to stop this. And he says, I'll stop it when he gets into MIT. Now, the problem with that, aside from what you think about it morally or ethically or anything like that, the problem with it is he's not going to get into MIT. Like, getting into MIT is not only about
Mm.
him being good in math, it's also about him not being in a hospital rehab so that he doesn't pull his eyebrows and his hairs out.
Wow.
So the focus, you have to look at the parent who is just focused on performance because it's easy. Performance is easy, right? And I did the same thing. My youngest son was a pretty average student. He was like a B- student, always B-. And it was like, Jeremy, can't you just like make that a B? Does it always have to be a B? Anyway, he's the one that was offered the job. He's about to
Wow.
become a dad. He's probably the one in the family that is most kind, and so we're just, I'm married with 3 children and now 2.5 grandchildren. One's on the way. And it's like, you got to think long and hard about what's going to matter
Yeah.
in a child.
Yeah. Okay. So then, Madeline, the book,
Yes.
okay, the book took a turn at the end that I was not suspecting, and I loved it. So you have this book about preparing our kids for change. And then at the end, you touched on the change that we will experience once our children are grown. And you had so many touching things in there about how one of your sons had said something like, you no longer have children, but you'll always have kids, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And so you're talking about this concept of building scaffolding, and we're kind of so hyper focused on building scaffolding for our children. How are we going to get them out into the adult world? But what about ourselves? What do we need to be thinking about for ourselves?
So thanks for picking up on that. That's really, that chapter is my favorite part of the book. Because I think I contribute to a hypervigilance about children by writing about children all the time. So I'm giving people another task to do when they're raising children. When 5 kids, I mean, how many other tasks can be dumped on you? So it's really important, I think, to see the part of my writing that's about adults, and a little bit of it is clear. The number of women who I've seen in my practice over the years who are lost when their children leave home, who are still doing the laundry, who are still making the meals, have not prepared themselves for a role where being mom is not primary. You're still mom. That was a good line from my son. You'll
Mhm.
always have kids. I'm still a mom, but I got a lot of hours in the day where I'm not making lunches, driving kids to soccer, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think I said the 2 things on a personal level that I felt like I really missed and had to make up. One was friendships. 3 kids, big career, a surgeon husband. a mother with Alzheimer's. I just didn't make time, and that
Mm,
was a big mistake. And because that's the missing community. That's the
right,
missing community.
right.
And frankly, COVID gave me the opportunity to change that. So I
Wow,
do have a group
that's
of friends.
ironic.
Well, yeah, but
Tell us why.
because I
That's
couldn't go anywhere.
counterintuitive.
I no, because I was traveling all over the country before. I was never
Oh,
every week I was off somewhere.
wow.
So
Yeah,
I
you are
was
in
never in
hot
one
demand.
place.
Yes, that,
Y-
that is a
Yeah.
thing about you. You're in hot demand. Okay, yeah, that does make a lot of sense then.
So that because what I realized for all of us is I had a narrow toolbox, right? You needed a toolbox to get through COVID. And when they first announced it, I go, oh, great. I'm kind of introverted. I'm a writer. I'm a shrink. I'm in my office a lot of the time. Fine. So I'm like, oh, that's going to be great. I'll get to write for the next 2 weeks, which turned into
Right,
2 years,
right,
right? And
right.
nobody wants to write every day for 2 years.
No,
So,
right.
it makes you realize what's your coping skills and
Mm,
how can you enlarge them? Because
yeah,
when your kids transition out of the house, you're going to be very sad if you don't. Like, I don't have really hobbies, which I'm doing a lot of thinking about. I love to read. I like culture, and the arts and stuff like that. But I don't have a hobby. That's my next task for myself. Um,
oh, I'm so curious.
I'll
I
let
want to
you
know
know.
what it
I'll
is
let you
when
know.
you, yes.
It'll be something with design, or it's something totally outside of what I've been doing. But I'm still busy and I have grandchildren, so
Mhm.
that's wonderful. But the moms who had nothing except their kids' achievement, and the kid leaves and they realize, that bumper sticker that is a stand-in for I'm a great parent, or the Harvard or Yale or Stanford Brown bumper sticker that says, oh, look what an accomplished parent I have, an accomplished child. And the kid graduates college and that bumper sticker is no longer relevant. And I think women need other women. Um, I think that was missing for me. And I know the price of that was increased focus on my children. It was what mattered. And here's an interesting story you can't see, but right outside here, I have a little garden. I'm in San Francisco. And during COVID, I had a string of kids come sit out in the garden, at 6 feet with masks on, depressed, 18, 19, 20, 21.
Mm,
Oh, it's never going to end. And I'm so depressed. And they're smoking weed and playing games all day long. And
mhm.
there were a lot of them. So I decided, I made a deal. I said, you can continue to see me on one condition, and that's that you do something of service for other people
Wow.
during COVID. And I had a list, you could do Jewish family service, you could do Meals on Wheels, it didn't
Mhm,
matter what you did, but you had to be of service in some way, and not spend so damn much time thinking about, how awful life was for you, because it was a lot more awful for a lot of other people.
mhm.
And in my professional career, that was the best thing I ever did. I would love to
Wow.
tell you that I'm a brilliant psychologist and I interpreted their depression and they got better. Nah, it really was the expectation that the world is not all about you.
Mhm.
And I'm happy to see you if you're happy to be a contributor. And
Wow. That reminds
and I
me of
think
what you wrote about optimism, which I
Mhm,
really loved that part about optimism. And I've not heard anybody say that. People are talking about the job market is changing, and you had
mhm,
statistics in there too about our kids are going to have jobs that we don't even know what they are. And so they're going to have to be flexible and they're going to have to be creative. But you said optimism was one of the characteristics, one of the competencies that our kids should have. And then you talked about how how do we become optimistic? There was a whole thing about pessimism and optimism, and I'm going to have to kind of scooch through my notes to find where I put it, but I thought that was so interesting. You talked about how it kind of starts in childhood.
yeah, it does. And it's I want to say something about all the things I talk about. And that's, people might say, well, resilience or optimism or any of these things, isn't that just genetic? Some kids, five of them, some are happier than others, some are more active than others. And that's true. I mean, there's always a genetic component, but I like the phrase, genetics loads the gun and environment pulls the trigger.
Mm.
And so I'm interested in optimism because by nature I am very pessimistic, and it's not a good thing. I mean, pessimism more realistic. That's the only that's the only thing that we have that's good, but it's not a good idea to cultivate your pessimism. It's a much better idea to cultivate your optimism. And that has to do with how you see things, how you process things. If I give a talk and it doesn't go well, let's use that as an example. The optimist would say, God, I was really tired. That was a long trip cross country, and I'll do better next time. And the pessimist would say, that's you, Madeline. You never get it right. It's always a problem for you. Those are two very different ways of seeing the same thing. And because we know that optimism is tied to a whole bunch of healthy mental health outcomes,
Right.
when your child comes and says, I'm so stupid, I failed my math test because I'm stupid, that's a correction you need to make. And before you make it, have the child think about it. Like, what makes you, this is what we do in our office. Somebody comes to my office, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, and says that, what makes you think that? Well, Ma, look, I got an F on my test. Huh, okay. And what else makes you think that? Well, I got a B on my last test. Oh, that's really interesting. What do you mean? So, you're trying to help them think through pessimistic thinking,
Mm.
which is, I'm always stupid, when in fact, it's not like that. The way we started this interview, I was bad teacher. I just wasn't good at it. But out of that, I learned something else. So I could go around and say, I really suck at teaching. It was such a failure for me. God, it was embarrassing. Or I can say what it really was. It was an opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big thing. I think if parents saw those failures, and I don't like the word failure because I'm a mom and a grandma, like, go have your child fail. That's a tough sell, right?
Yeah.
I think
Right.
a tough sell. I think of it as trial and error learning.
Mm.
I learned, it was trial and error. I tried something and it didn't work. And
Yeah.
so I learned from it.
Yeah.
And I think if we thought about those experiences as learning opportunities instead of as failures, and communicated that to our kids,
Mhm.
that would be helpful.
Yeah. And the growth mindset. And what you had written in here about optimism, which is what made me think about it. And you were talking about the kids that were sitting in there having a hard time in COVID, which it would have been a really hard age. I have thought a lot about what I'm glad I was at the age I was at when things shut down because we were kind of settled in our life. But if you're 18, 19, trying to launch, those are hard years. But you
Yeah,
said childhood pessimism is a precursor to adult pessimism and is associated with depression. So
depression.
dealing with it early is important. Doing things for other people increases optimism. So does the practice of gratitude. Oh,
Mhm,
wow. I would not have thought that. I would have thought
mhm,
optimism is you just have to, talk yourself out of it.
mhm.
And well, which would be the practice of gratitude in some ways, but just to do things for other people increases your optimism. So that's what made me think about when you were talking about those college age kids and
Yeah.
to get out in the world and to invest in it. And so that was really a striking thing for I
It,
learned so much from this book.
oh, thank you so much. I think the thing about optimism, gratitude is like those, you can cultivate them for sure. You can cultivate them for sure. But if I'm right that this hyper focus on achievement is a function of a loss of community, what better way to get back a sense of purpose at the end of the day?
Mm.
That's the end of the day,
Yeah.
is, do you have a purpose? And that's what you want your kids to have. And it really will not matter where they went to school, they should go to college. We know kids who go to college end up with better paying jobs, but the idea that you have a purpose in life is, that's foundational.
Yeah. Yeah, and you had this whole section of just about courageousness, and I thought, oh, the book is just such a great read. How do you become brave? I mean, because if you do these things, if you allow your child to be a B- student, if you
Yeah.
don't have the honor roll sticker, if they don't go to Harvard or Yale, you're doing things different than the culture is sort of screaming. And so you have to be brave, I think. You have to
Yes.
be courageous to trust in the chaos and to
Mhm.
trust in these unmeasurable, I don't even know if that's a word, immeasurable things. And so you talk about cultivating bravery.
Yeah.
How do
Yeah.
we do that?
Well, again, I think I've made it clear that I think a lot of it comes back to us, not our
Yeah.
children. And I think the story in there was about or maybe it was one of my other books about my son got invited. Jeremy, the same kid, had asthma. He got invited to climbing camp. I was out of my mind with anxiety about it, but he had it under good control. He knew what to do. I decided to let him go, worried that he wouldn't breathe. I was the one who couldn't breathe the whole weekend until he came home and I could exhale. So we have to challenge ourselves with the information that allowing these kinds of things to happen in our children's lives builds growth, builds resilience, builds character.
Hmm.
And again, if you don't have somebody to talk to, if you don't have a community to go, it's very hard to tolerate that much anxiety.
Yeah.
It's much easier. It would have been so much easier to say you're not allowed to go. So we're testing ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're cultivating bravery in ourselves in order to cultivate it in our families. And you talked about, well, you just said about the breath. There are days when any of us would be hard pressed to find time to take a restorative breath, yet doing just that is critical to our goals. And then you talk about sleep. Let's just get enough sleep. Can our
Yeah.
kids and can we just get enough sleep and that will change things? So, Madeline, what a phenomenal book. Ready or Not, Preparing Our
Thank you.
Kids to Thrive in an Uncertain and Rapidly Changing World. It has really been such a gift to be able to have read this book and gotten so much out of it and then to get to talk to you about it. Thank you. I can't wait to read the other ones. I learned so much and it gave me so much to think about. And like I said, I've been talking to other people about their squiggly paths. And,
Yeah.
it's like, where do you find bravery? Well, you find it in books like yours. It helps you to be courageous and to live differently. So thank you for your time.
Absolutely. I want to say one more thing. I'm picking up a lot of interesting things just out of this discussion with you, the things that interest you. And you picked up on bravery, you picked up on optimism. Now imagine if those things were as important in a family as
Mm,
grades or performance, right? If
yeah,
at dinner when you're talking about something and you say, well, we're a brave family, and I think whatever it is, like if you're saying we don't think that much about mental health, but we should
yes,
because one out depends what statistic you're looking at. One out of three or one out of four kids is going to have a mental health crisis,
wow,
and that is a huge number. It's more than have asthma. It's more than have any illness, and we're not paying enough attention to it. So
yeah,
it challenges us to challenge them
yes.
and
And
ourselves.
it gave me tools. Like even our youngest daughter is 6 and she signed up with her older sister who's 9 to be in this really little play in our community. I mean, she had like 10 lines. She was the Three Little Pigs. And for a couple weeks ahead of time, she was really distraught. I'm so scared. And I don't know. I think maybe had I not read your book or different things, maybe I would have pulled her. But I just kept
Mhm.
saying, it's okay to be scared. I get scared
Mhm.
about things. You're brave, and then she did it and she did great. And so just even that, just the verbiage and the skill set to make these choices. Madeline, because this is the 1000 Hours Outside podcast, and we
Yeah.
talked about play and the importance of play, we always end our podcast with the same question. So the question is, what is a favorite outdoor childhood memory that you have?
My favorite, as soon as you said it, it's there was a tree in the alley in the back of the house. And I loved climbing that tree with other kids. I went back to my house that I grew up in recently, and the first thing I went to see was that tree.
Wow.
So
Wow.
I felt a real connection with the tree as a child. Yeah,
Mhm.
that's my first memory.
It's beautiful simplicity. Madeline, thank you so much for your time and for your writing and for all the things that you're doing to really impact families and parents around the world.
Thank you, Janine. Thank you for what you're doing. It's critically important. It's critically important.